I'll start out with just a brief overview of some of the newest automations. As you probably know, if you're attending this webinar, we have an automation engine function as part of SmartSuite. And if you're a solution manager or an admin, you have access to this panel where you can configure automation actions and triggers for your solution. Here listed just a few of the ones that I wanted to highlight. We've recently added Google Sheets. For you Microsoft fans, Outlook is now supported. You can send email via Outlook, as well as Microsoft Teams. And something that maybe is little known, Teams has a much larger number of users than Slack. Many big companies and smaller ones too are using Microsoft Teams to communicate. So we're now supporting both chat as well as in-channel messages, and then HubSpot. So let's click into a few of these and just take a look around. So here, just have a very basic trigger set up, triggering when a record's created in my Bugs app. And we'll take a look at our Google Add Sheets row action. So what happens when you come in here, you have to OAuth connect your Google account. And from there, you can select the target spreadsheet. And what we're doing right now, we're just supporting adding rows. We're going to, and this is a general statement, we're going to be adding many additional action types. As you'll see when you go to add action, many of these just have one or two just to get us started. As I mentioned with Microsoft Teams, adding a chat message, which is a DM versus posting in a channel. But we'll be expanding this to support a number of additional options for each one of these as we go. Overall, our strategy is to add a number of different integration actions. These are the outbound actions that can be taken in response to changes in data that you have in SmartSuite. But we're going to be circling back, and you see this if we go back up to the top with triggers. We want to also add a number of additional integration triggers. So we're working on that with Gmail right now, and we're going to expand that list so that we have a whole variety of additional options. I did also want to mention while we're here that the next big set of capabilities are going to be around webhooks. So if you're not familiar with webhooks, what that basically is the ability to interact with what's called REST APIs. This is an industry standard that allows you to hook systems together, either initiating an action based on the receipt of a webhook, which is basically just an HTTP request that is pointed at a particular URL, and you get the information that's payloaded in that request. And then you'll be able to take actions within SmartSuite, create or update records and all of the rest. Same thing on the action side. We'll be adding webhook actions here as well, so that you have the ability to, even if we don't support a system directly, if they have a REST API, you'll be able to form a request that can be used to take some action in that external system. You also see a few of these listed as coming soon, and I'm doing this from our internal staging environment. This is where we test things out before we take it live, just so that you can see the complete list of what's currently in progress. So Slack and Twilio have been out for a while. Teams is brand new, and that'll be available soon. One thing I did want to say about Teams, and let me go to that actual configuration. Here, if we drill into Teams, in order to do this, to be able to send to a Teams channel, you're actually going to need Microsoft Teams admin permissions. So it's just something to keep in mind. This is a Microsoft thing. We basically have to set up a chat bot in that channel. So just keep that in mind when you're looking at setting up Teams. You'll need to get your Teams admin involved too, to get all of the credentials set correctly. But once you do, and actually this one is set to send a chat message. Let me change this over. And we'll go to send a message in a channel. I've got my Teams account set up here. First thing that you're going to do is pick your team, and then it will load the channels that you have access to. And then you type your message. and it supports rich text and links and all of that kind of good stuff so that you can get the right information into that channel and keep your team posted on things that are going on in SmartSuite. So that's a quick intro. I'm going to pause there because viewing these is relatively straightforward. They all take essentially the same type of format. We'll drill in here and take a quick peek at Outlook. And it's all of the things that you would expect to find. OAuth credential, configurable send to, just like our own internal email action type, you can select emails either from the triggering record, or you can just explicitly type in a value. Same with subject and message. There is one additional feature down here at the bottom. You can optionally include what we call field comparisons. So if you were sending a status message and it may be relevant to the receiving user what the prior state of a changed value was, say that this went from in development to ready for testing, you can show that here explicitly by selecting the field. And that pattern is followed through basically in all of these. The systems that have dynamic fields or custom fields like Salesforce and others, when you go to actually add a field value, it's going out to that system and it's retrieving all of the available options. So you're not just limited to the ones that they create by default, you've got all of your custom fields available here as well. So let me pause there. Emma or Brian, maybe you can give me a hand to see if there are any questions that are inbound that I can answer in relation to automation actions.
Sure. We have a quick question. When sending an email through an automation, will there be a copy of it posted to the task that it's being sent from?
There isn't an automatic copy in the task or the generating record, but one thing that you can do, and keep this in mind just in general when you're setting up automations, is that you can chain actions. So if you wanted a copy or you wanted to make a record that you had reached out and this email had actually sent, I could add another action and either update the triggering record, or I could create a new record. Maybe I want an email log app. And every time I send out an email, I make a copy. I can put any relevant information, the date and time it was sent, maybe the status, who sent it, and you've got that as a running log. You could use that same technique just to store every change that you made to a record. Maybe you have some very important information, you want to monitor every change, and anytime something changes, you go create a log entry that lists that. Of course, change tracking is also available within the records themselves, but sometimes it's nice to have an actual record where you can put that in reports, charts, graphs, all of that sort of thing. Hope that answers the question. Any other questions? Yep.
We have some questions about the new feature that's coming as far as the communication feature. Someone's mentioning that Monday shows emails between themselves and the client. So is this coming in SmartSuite? And can you talk a little bit more about this?
Sure, happy to dive into that one. A little off topic, but that's all right. Let me actually flip over to our production environment and let me pull something up. So you're probably already familiar with the capability of sending or managing comments. You'll notice that the name here has changed to Communication Center. And now you've got a settings option that didn't used to be there, where I can come in here and see this email badge. This is alpha. We're putting it out there for a kind of a subset of our customers to start playing with. So I will encourage you not to use this in production yet. You can feel free to do that when this badge turns to beta, when we feel like we've reached a level of stability where it's reasonable to start testing it out in live environments and interacting with customers and that sort of thing. But for now, let's enable it and just see what that does to our user interface. And you can see here, if I can move my Zoom bar, that Now we've got a tabbed interface up here at the top, and by default we're on comments, but I can go to all, and you can see that now I have a new email button in addition to a new comment button. And if I click that, I get an email composer. And this email composer it's just like the composer that you'll find in automations, where you can go select fields. You can come in here and grab field values out of the record, or you can just type, and you can combine the two as well, just like you can in our automation system. And then when I'm done composing, and I need a 2, let's just send this to Peter at SmartSuite. Send my email, and you can see, and again, this is alpha. We don't have everything perfectly formatted, but you can see that the email record shows up. I can even reply to this email, and it comes up with that 2 pre-populated. I can see that I'm replying another note and send that email. And again, it pops up here, and you've got the same capabilities of liking. You can delete it. You can copy a link to it, just like you can in notification. You can also do notifications right in line as well. And you can you can choose to show all of them simultaneously. Again, a little caution here. This is very new. We've just released it. We already know of one particular issue. So before you flood me with comments, when you actually receive the email, if you reply to that email, it's not coming back into the panel just yet. We have a little bit of a configuration thing that we're working on there. That should be fixed in the next day, and then you can really start seeing how that interactivity works. But the outbound send is working. All of these comment cards are showing up and scrolling and working as they should. So please do give us feedback and be tolerant as we work through some of the issues that will invariably come up. But I'm really excited about this. I think it's going to be a tremendous value and very useful in any number of situations when you have an app in SmartSuite where you're heavily interacting with customers. So I hope you enjoy it, and definitely give us some comments and feedback on things that we could do even better. All right, any other questions, Emma?
Yes, one about automation conditions. Will they be able to compare between 2 field values instead of just testing the value of the field itself? For example, the last updated field goes to the due date field value?
Not right now. That has certainly been requested, and is something that will probably, the preliminary support for that will be with automation scripts, which is coming after webhooks. So order of operations here, we're going to implement outbound webhook, inbound webhook, and then script action. And what the scripting action is going to do, behind the scenes, we already use a JavaScript API to do things and interact with information on the front end. We're going to expose that to a scripting environment where you'll be able to add an action type of script and write actual JavaScript using a number of functions that we'll make available to you to do things like search, update records, and in the process, you could do those types of comparisons. You could iterate through lists of records. You could make multiple updates. There will be some limits on it, just so that people don't create things that run infinitely or go create a million records. There will be certain parameters that you have to operate within, but that type of comparison operation will absolutely be supported. That'll be the first. The other thing that we're planning on doing here, and there have been a ton of requests for this as well, you'll notice that when you add multiple criteria in this conditions section, your only options here are to and or the entire block. And in certain cases, that means you have to essentially create copies of the same automation to handle different paths where you want this to be true, but not this, but also these other criteria. So we're looking at some user interface right now where you can nest these. and have layers of ands and groups of ors and all of that kind of thing, so that you could say, if this is true and any of these other conditions are true, or this other condition. So you'll be able to do quite a bit there as well. Okay. What else? Any other questions in the queue?
Is there an ETA for scripting?
We haven't set a date yet because we're still getting through the planning process. It will likely be in phases where we want to add a whole variety of things that'll make your lives easier as you're creating automation. We want to be able to test things with actual data out of your records so that you can see what's going to happen and be able to debug your scripts and see how long it takes to execute and all of those sorts of things. So we're still in the planning phase. I would guess that it's coming either in later Q1 or early Q2, but that's a guesstimate at this point. The actions for webhooks should be significantly faster. Just within a couple of weeks, we anticipate round 1, and that's been phased in kind of 2 different batches. We're going to make some enhancements to the way that we're handling certain things on the outbound side in a phase 2, but you should see those landing here in the next few weeks. All right. What's next, Emma?
Will there be an automation for follow-up email sequences?
For follow-up email sequences, do we have any more information about that? I'm not quite clear on what function we're getting after there. I suppose what we're talking about is the ability to send an email and then get a reply. Does that look like it fits? Let me talk a little bit about that. Yeah, so right now, the system that we're putting in place for Communication Center is doing that, right? We're generating the email, and what we're doing in this first phase of Communication Center is SmartSuite itself is sending the email. We send that through Amazon so that we can listen to all of the replies. And when we get a reply to one of those emails and it has an ID in it so that we know what thread it relates to, we can bring that back in and associate it with the record that created it and put it in the proper order and show who sent it and all of those kinds of things. We can use that same mechanism down the road in automations because we'll already have the infrastructure. So we will more than likely add the ability to toggle that on when you're generating SmartSuite notifications, which include that email outbound content. I don't have that on the roadmap yet. It's been requested, but I have some good news. You can already do it. It just takes an external actor. And in this case, I'm actually going to show you how to do that in make.com right now. That'll be something that we take a look at here in the next few minutes. Anything else on automations?
There's a quick question. What is the timeline for being able to use an automation to add a comment to a record?
Automation to add a comment. I'm going to have to take a look on a roadmap and see where that one's at. I know that we've had that request before. You can actually do it through the API. So I'm going to show you a technique using make.com where you can make an arbitrary API call. I know that gets a little complicated for some. It's a little more technical, but we'll put that and bump it on the roadmap and get back to you on the timeline for that one. Emma, you had something as well?
Yes. Someone would love to see a little demo on how to use the Google Sheets action.
Okay. Sure, I've got one configured right here. And what this is saying is that I'm going to trigger just when the record's created, just keeping things simple. And when here, we can do this from scratch. Let me just, I'll delete this action and we'll say, okay, I would like to go use Google Sheets, and we're going to, right now we just have the ability to add a row. The first thing that happens is you have to link your Google account, and that just gives you the standard pop-up. I'll show you what it looks like. You get this pop-up, you click sign in with Google, that'll open the Google authentication window. When you're done with that, you get the selector, and it will be, it actually opens this modal. It's just it's related to the Google authorization, so we show it in this UI, but you have to pick which of your Google Sheets you would like to go update. Pick this Zapier test one. So that sets the sheet, and then of course they can have tabs. So you have to select which individual worksheet you would like to add. And then, oh, my Zoom bar is in the way again. Move that up. I can click add field, and it's reading in the column headers from that worksheet. And then all you have to do is pick the ones that you would like to populate, and then what you want to put in there. And again, our field selector is available to place things either from the trigger or even system fields available where you can get things. The really useful one here, a couple of them, the current username and a link to the record. That's the share record link, like you would get out of the UI. You can actually use that if you wanted to create like a link back in that spreadsheet to take you directly to the record. You can fill that out for any number of columns, and you save it. And as soon as you start adding additional records to the app that's triggering it, you're going to go create rows. That's all there is to it. Pretty straightforward. We eventually will have the ability to do updates as well. Updates are a bit more complicated because you have to tell it what you want to match on to say, hey, I want to go update this row or rows in my Google Sheet. So that's coming further down the line, but for right now, you can just append. Hope that kind of gets you started. Other questions before we move over to Make? Brian, Emma, anything left on automations?
Yes. One last question. Can
Okay.
you see a demo on how to change the default text by selecting a type or a status?
Changing the default text by selecting a type or status.
I believe they mean setting the condition as a status and then the text. I'm not sure what type of text they're referring to.
Okay, I can show a couple of different things. I'm not sure that I completely understand the question, but you have a few different options for triggering updates. You can do it. Obviously, we've been demoing when records created. That's straightforward. Just when the record is initially created, whatever data it has in it is used as the triggering record, and then you proceed with the actions. We also have updated, and that requires the record to actually be saved. When it's saved, that updating record will trigger the actions, and you can proceed from there. We also have this when record matches condition, and this is useful in a number of different ways. Say you have time values and you want to wait whether today, a certain date field equals today. You can do that using this matches a condition, and it fires when the condition begins to match. So we've changed this so that you don't get loops. It could be that when we initially implemented it, we would just continue to match and you had to do something to the record to get it to stop. Now it just fires when it begins to match, and you can specify what criteria to use. Here, You can either create records, which we've talked through previously, or you can update the triggering record. There is another option that we've recently added. If I delete this, we also have the option to find records. And what that allows you to do is actually pick which solution. So it's open to any solution in your workspace that you have access to at the time you're configuring it. And then you pick the app, and then you pick the conditions that you want to use to match. And this is handy for a whole variety of use cases. If you wanted to find the right staff resource to put on a project, or the list of available venues for some event that you're putting on based on certain criteria, you can return that list. I also wanted to point out this advanced feature where you can tell the system how many records you want to return. So in the maximum is 100. And that's actually the default. So you'll get up to the first 100 matching records, and then you can pick how they're sorted. The reason that's important is, say I just want one record. I'm going to use one record, and I'm going to use its values to go update some other stuff. You need to tell us how you want those records sorted, because if I match more than one, otherwise you just get an arbitrary pick from that list. And that's probably not what you want. So you might want to say, I want to do this by last updated in descending order so that I get the most recent. From there, if you do subsequently, you do an update action, we can use those results and actually make changes in those records. Now, when you're setting up, let me go back to basics here. So I think the original question was just setting status conditions and that sort of thing. If I find the record that I want to go update, you can set fields like status either explicitly. So maybe I know that whatever criteria I've specified here means that this is ready for review. I can say that kind of statically, and that status will be applied. I could also map it. So if I had that value in one of the triggering records fields, I could use it as well. I'm not sure that answered the question, but
So
just a few things on configuration of actions.
the use case would be, there's several types of meetings that this person hosts, and based on the type of the meeting, that we need to populate a different smart doc field.
I see. So you want to select which smart doc field to update based on trigger conditions.
I believe it's
Right
the
at the
same
moment.
smart doc field, but just based on the selection of the type of meeting, assuming through like a single select, it would populate default text for smart doc.
I see. Okay. For the moment, that type of conditional logic, let's just go back to our basic example where when this is updated, or let's say, yeah, when it's updated, I want to take the action of populating. Let's say I'm going to populate its description, and I wanted to have different text in here based on, or maybe this is when it's created, based on what type was selected, you get a different default populated text. You would actually have to separate those into separate automations for now until we have that scripting, or some of the even nested conditions or complex conditions won't really do it, because you need conditional actions, which we do not yet support. And again, we'll probably support that initially through scripting. But for now, what you would need to do is come in here and say, okay, if status is equal to, and you wouldn't use status probably, you'd use some sort of a type selector. Okay, if it's type 1, then we want to update the record and put type 1's description in it. And then you could just, to save time, you could actually, let me add this automation. You can duplicate automations. So if the structure is basically the same, but you just need to do what we were saying here, we need 2 different ones so that we can have a different criteria. We could just copy it and say, okay, if it's this type 2, now I want to go update it with type 2's description. So you just have the same type of criteria, it's just evaluating it a little differently and then taking the action if it matches. And for now, you just have to have multiple automations to handle that particular use case. Okay, because we're already 37 minutes in, why don't we switch over to make.com real briefly? And I just want to show you the basics to get us started, and then I'm happy to answer questions, because people have been very excited about us adding the Make connector, and I just want to give you an overview of how it looks. So let me switch my view here real quick. And I've got an environment set up where we can do a little bit of testing, and I will flip over into Make. So the way that Make is organized, and some of you may be Zapier users. Zapier is a much more linear configuration where you have a trigger condition at the top and then a series of actions that kind of flow vertically down the page. Make is completely different. Make calls these things scenarios, and you come into them here and click into a scenario or create a new one. Let's take a look at a configured one first. And there are a bunch of things going on here. You can see a visual depiction of the steps in the scenario with the relationships. You see a run history. In this case, there's something waiting in the queue to be processed because I was doing some testing. You can also get history, and you can see if there were errors or if it succeeded, and all kinds of information about what has happened with this particular, again, what they call scenario. So let's go in and edit one of these. And this is about as basic as it gets. This is the equivalent of one of our automations where when a record is updated, create a record. So we were just doing this within SmartSuite. You probably wouldn't use Make to do this unless you need to do some processing that we don't support directly. But just to get the basics, and let me back out and just do one from scratch so you can see the entire process. You start by clicking Create New Scenario, and you get this big Add Something icon that you click on. You get a big long selector that contains a whole variety of different things that you can use that are integrated with the Make platform. In this case, I am going to select SmartSuite, and this invited link means that I used the shared link to get access to it, and hopefully Brian or Emma could post the link to the Make invite, since it doesn't appear that we're live just yet. But hopefully, again, this comes off today and you can see it just by searching within Make. When you have access to it, click on it, and instead of, they say trigger here, but they call their triggers watchers. So we can watch new records or we can watch updates, and you can see that these are instant watchers. What that means is that we're pushing webhooks, basically an outbound notification that something has changed, directly to Make so that they can immediately take action. It doesn't require Make to look and ask SmartSuite, hey, has anything happened here? They are proactively notified. We can also create a record, update a record, or make some other call to the SmartSuite API using our credentials. In this case, I'm just going to watch for updates. And Their interface, they like to use the term webhook a lot, which is technically accurate, but maybe a little different for those of you who are less technical users. All a webhook is, as I was describing to the action types and the triggers that we're adding, is the ability to interact with an external API using what's called REST, which is an industry standard for that type of peer-to-computer communication. And I can either use one that's been configured. In most cases, you're going to be adding a new one where you can give it a name. We'll just call this webinar test update. And I can select my connection to my workspace, which is called Peter's workspace. To add a new one, it just requires you to enter in your workspace ID and your API key. And let me show you how to get that real quick in case you don't know. Your workspace ID is this. These 8 characters are your workspace ID, and that's constant across all the pages in your app, so you don't have to be in a particular place to get it. Your API key is right here. If you click that, it takes you to the section in your profile that has the API key. You can click into it and copy it. Careful, this destroy token, it will do just that. It will remove the token. It immediately invalidates it. So anything that it's used in will not function until you create a new one and use the new key. So important safety tip. By the way, in this menu, if you're not an admin or I think a solution creator, the API key doesn't show in the menu, but it's still here. So just select general preferences or something and scroll down. It's just less in your face for users who don't use this more technical stuff all the time, but it's still there. If we go back over here into Make, once I've done this, I can go select what solution I want to go interact with. And from there, I select the app. And I just save it. And now it's configured to go, once this is activated, and it's not by default, and I'm going to show you how to do this here in just a second, it will listen to updates that SmartSuite sends to it about records being updated. So in the interest of time, I'm going to go back to our pre-created to show you the other side of this. And we're going to edit. So once you've got that trigger or watcher, as they would say, set up, just by hovering the other side of the circle, we have the option to add what they call a module. SmartSuite itself is a module. So in this case, I just added a connection back again to my test solution. And then just like we do in our automations, you map in either values from a prior step or the watcher, or you can explicitly, like I've done here, just add text. They also, and this will probably be the subject of an entirely separate webinar where we go through more advanced use cases, but they have a whole variety of options for managing and manipulating data. If we have time here at the end, I'll show you some more advanced scenarios that use these, but you have math functions available, you have text functions, you've got date and time functions, array functions, which are very powerful for more advanced use cases. So you can really get in here and basically have the values of each of these fields be calculated, which is pretty cool. And hopefully I'll have enough time to show you some examples of that here at the end. The other important thing to note is this linkage between the modules is clickable. When you click on it, that I can conditionally let things through this path. So in this case, I'm watching for record updates, but I'm only letting the ones through that have a status that's equal to complete. And here as well, they've got a whole bunch of different options for doing different types of evaluation. Since it's pretty flexible, they don't pre-select what type you're interacting with, whether it's a string, it's a number, it's a date, and there are different operators that apply to each one. So it's up to you to know to select the right thing to make sure that you're evaluating whatever that data is correctly. And then when we actually run the scenario, we'll see what gets through and what doesn't. Let's run this again. And this, make sure that I'm looking at the, okay, make test. This run once feature is nice for testing. And when you're debugging, if it catches something and you aren't running this actively, you can choose to process the existing records. In this case, I'm going to tell it to listen to a brand new record so that we can explicitly go create one. So let's go over here. This is an app that it's pointing at. It's listening to updates to app 1. So we can create a new record. And remember that status check is for, is it complete? Now, if we go back here to make, you'll see we're still running because the event that it got didn't get the event because we're only listening to update events, and that was just a create. So if I come in here and maybe I say this is a high priority item, it just got a catch. When you're running these in this designer environment, you get this thought bubble that comes up. And if you click on it, you can see all of the data that was sent in that event, which is pretty cool. So we can expand this and see all of the record data that was just sent to it. Here's my Peter demo record. And then you also get an indicator on how many items from the one or more that are here, because there are action types that they could catch a whole bunch of things up front. I can see that it didn't make it past my filter. You get a little red indicator that status is not equal to complete. So it didn't get to our second module. I run this again. And again, listen for new. Come back over here. We'll make one more update and set it to complete. Come over here. We have that, all of that information available again. We see that one actually matched. Oh, and then we have an error condition. When you have an error condition, it shows you the little red icon in the thought bubble, and it gives you some information. And it's not liking our assign to for some reason. So let's go back in here. See what we have mapped. And I found that every once in a while, one of these configurations needs to be saved twice before it actually takes. Let's see if just resaving this. And they also do have an explicit save here. So we can tell it to save the scenario. And let's run this one more time and see if we make it through. Again, any change should trigger it. Yep, and that did the trick. So we received one, we let one through, and then one actually succeeded on this module, which is the action to go create a record. So if we come back over here, we should see that, yep, my Peter demo record with all of its values was just copied over. So that's the base scenario. I've got some more advanced examples that I can show, but I'll pause here and just answer any questions that people might have about Make or the basics of its configuration and interaction with SmartSuite.
Peter, the audience would like to know if you have a favorite Make or Zapier. And maybe
Ooh.
difference between, a lot of people are trying to decide which one to go with. So if you could explain why someone would want to use either one of them.
I'll try to be impartial and just be factual here and tell you how I see it. Zapier has what I would say for people who are just getting started with automations, it's pretty straightforward. They're a little more hand-holding and it's a bit more linear. And if you find yourself creating things that are just maybe a step or two long and you don't have very many transactions per month, Zapier is a great choice. It's easy to get started. They support a whole bunch of different systems and it's relatively user-friendly. It's easy to navigate. I can do another one of these where I can do some Zapier configuration and show you the basics there as well and how to use it to interact with SmartSuite. Make, I like a lot for its flexibility. I think maybe the downside with Make is that it does have some interface quirks that take a little bit of getting used to. This builder interface is very powerful once you get the hang of it, but it's a bit of a steeper learning curve, I would say. Other things that I really like about Make are the ability to use those inline functions and data manipulation. Very cool. I like that a lot. I will say that Zapier has the edge if you're writing code in more technical use cases. It's easier to get JavaScript code steps to execute in Zapier. You can do it in Make, but they require you to host the code in Google Apps or something. And it's another level of complexity, but it's very powerful. And just to highlight, let me switch back over here to one of my other scenarios to show you what I mean by this. Let's look at this one. So to give you background context for this scenario, I need to switch to this webinar solution. Okay, so I have these 4 apps. Just look at these 4, this request, people, sites, and distances. The scenario that we were able to support, and I modeled this after an actual customer scenario. They have people, contractors really, that need to work at different sites. They have requests for them to work at those sites. And actually, this is a very simplified version of this. Here, I just said what day of the week and what shift. The actual one that the customer is implementing is any day of the week, any hour of the day, with exceptions to that hours list, which was a little more complicated than I wanted to try to demo here. But the other wrinkle is that each individual person has a maximum distance that they're willing to travel to get to one of those sites. So maybe 5 miles in this user's case. And each of the sites has an address. The user has an address. Okay. So tell me the people who are within range of a site who also have availability for the right shifts for the right days. Pretty complicated, right? We broke down the approach to this by creating a 4th application that stores for each individual contractor, for each individual site, and you can see this auto-generated title representing that relationship, the distance between that site and that contractor, the maximum distance, I'm pulling this in from the people record with a formula, and then calculating whether or not I'm in range of that facility, right? So my max distance is 5 miles. I've got one that's 4, one that's 8, one that's 64. Obviously, those two are not in range. 4 miles is in range. So there are 2 steps to automating this in Make. The first step, and really there would be 2, because you need to create those records anytime a person is added, one of those contractor records, or a new site. We're watching for that, getting all of the existing sites. So this is assuming that you're adding a new person. And this is something that I wanted to point out for some of our more advanced users. Again, I can do an entire separate session on this. The make.com version of an outbound webhook, they just call HTTP, which is really what it is. You can specify credentials for it. This URL, and those of you who use our API will recognize this. This is the applications endpoint. I'm giving it the application ID and telling it to get me a list of all of the records. I'm posting it, and then I'm specifying some things like content type, account ID, and authorization credentials. I won't get into the details here. It's a little more in depth than we need to go for this session. But effectively what this does is it returns the entire set of records from that app. I don't have any conditions here, but I have this, what Make calls an iterator. And in that iterator, I'm passing over the array that comes from this request. It's just labeled data and items, and telling Make to do the next set of activities for each one that it receives. No criteria. And then I'm using the Google Maps API, which is available through Make. And I'm using the address information from each one of those returned records and the address from the person. I'm telling it to get distance by way of road. So it's not straight line, it's driving distance. And then over here in that distance record, and this is something that applies to more than just advanced use cases, you can create linked records. So I'm using the title from the site and the name from the person, which are both their title fields, to set the linked records. And then I'm using that distance value that I got from the Google API. Here's one of those operators, division, because they give it to you in a format that's not miles, it's of a mile. So we divide by 1,000 to get the miles. And that is what created these records where we've got this distance calculated by Google. Pretty cool. Because then we can come back in, and the follow-up to that is figuring out how we schedule. And this is where things get really interesting, because when requests come in, and here's my request, I need someone on this date. It's a Monday. I need these 2 shifts, and it's site A that needs the resource. I go get all of those distance records. There's our iterator again. And it's so for every one of those, it's performing this action. It does apply a filter because, and this looks a little weird because this is the field ID. It's not named because it hasn't come from a SmartSuite connector. That's why we're adding an explicit find action. That should be available soon. We already have it in testing so that you would get this value with a name on it back from SmartSuite as opposed to raw just from the API. And you just have this weird ID, which is actually this field over in distances. It's this formula. Pulling back the are we in range value. I'm comparing that to equals, and then the sites need to match as well. Again, we have the same situation where it's an ID, but this is the name of the site being equal to the site that we need for the request. And here's the other trick, is because these requests could be different days of the week. We're also filtering on day of the week. And this one is really cool for our more advanced users. You can compare lists using a variety of different array operators. And in this case, I have a list of values in a multi-select field. So I'm saying, do all of the time values in this particular record, are they contained in the ones that are required for the shift? And this keys function is just getting the key value and comparing them, because basically you get a list of keys. Are all the keys in both of these things? If so, it'll match and continue on and go add that individual contractor to the request. And that's done right down here, adding them to that people list. Now, this is a much more advanced scenario, but I just wanted to give you a sense for what could be done with these types of connectors, and you can do some pretty complicated things. So I know that's a lot. I don't want to dive too deeply into all of that unless I have specific questions, but happy to take some additional questions if we have them about Make and its capabilities, whether simple or on the more advanced side.
Yeah, so there is a question. So you showed that
Mhm.
you can iterate on lists or have the list of arrays in
Yep.
in the update. Are you also able to split line items?
Yeah, so Make doesn't really have a concept of line item. They just have arrays. Zapier does line items specifically, but a whole variety of these different things can be used to anywhere that you have an array returned. You can use an iterator to split it and do something on each element. They have a whole variety of other options. You can aggregate arrays. So if you've got stuff that you need to put together into a single list, you can do that. We looked at router. They have repeating actions. You can tell it to do this a certain number of times, to do something and then stop while it does something else and then resume, or you can have it commit a value after a certain number of things have happened. They have some pretty advanced capabilities. They also have the ability to create other aggregations. So you can create a whole data table that you use for more complex lookup. You can do numeric aggregators where you want to have a counter that you increment and that kind of thing. Encoding and converting text, all of that type of stuff as well outside of the arrays, but just a whole bunch of different ways that you can handle array data, including you could pass an entire array as a value and then use array operators to slice, merge. You could join arrays together and use their value. You can shuffle them up. You can flatten an array. You could just get the distinct elements. You could change a text into an array. They've got a split in here as well. So yeah, just a whole bunch of capability there, many of which I still need to do some research on. I haven't used all of them yet, but so far so good, very powerful. Other questions?
Someone was asking, unrelated to Make, or
Mhm.
asking about Ply from earlier and was asking if it could be used the same way you use Zapier or Make.
So Ply is interesting in that the way that Ply operates is that they install a Google Chrome plugin, and let's see if I have it installed here. I do. I'm not logged in currently. Essentially what Ply does is they integrate with specific platforms like email, and they've got a whole list. I don't know, 60 or 70 different platforms, and SmartSuite is one of those. And what it allows you to do is actually, once you click that Ply button, depending on the context that you're in, you could add buttons to the UI and do interesting things with it. So it's more of a user-centric integration as opposed to Zapier and Make.com are doing things in the background. They're responding to changes in data. Ply actually allows you to click a button on a UI and kick off an integration, essentially. So if I'm over in my Gmail, I can click Apply button. If I've configured it properly, it could go target this same, maybe this request comes in an email, you click a button that goes and creates a record here for you. So that's the difference with Ply, is that they're UI centric in these things as opposed to just back-end data React type of approach. Other questions?
It looks like that may be everything regarding Make.
Okay. Oh, one last thing I want to show you real quick, and we don't even have to demo this live, but it was just neat. In one of my last I wrote a blog post and did a video about using OpenAI. This was neat, and just I was playing around with it, and in the process discovered that Make has what they call a mail hook. In addition to a webhook that takes that HTTP request, they'll also generate you a unique email address that you can use to kick something off. And all you have to do is create one, copy that to the record, and then attach whatever you want to it. And you have access to all kinds of different information from that email, including the text of the email, the HTML from the email, subject from, to, all that kind of stuff. But I hooked this together with OpenAI ChatGPT and created just this quick little integration that sends generate an answer to this question with the contents of that email. So I'm listening for new emails, I'm sending them to OpenAI, and then creating a record in SmartSuite. Let me see if I still have this wired up. I will send to that big, long, ugly email address. Let's say, what's a good question, Brian? What are great uses for no-code platforms? And let's send that. Let's see if this is still wired up properly. It takes it a second because it's actual email, so it's not quite as instantaneous. Ah, we got it. We can see there's all of the information that you get from the email. I sent it to OpenAI in that particular model, and then I went and created a SmartSuite record, which is here in my inbox. And we can see what the response was. Yep. So they wrote us a little blurb on the use of no-code platforms. So I can think of a bunch of different ways that this could be used. I'm going to do a separate blog post on using OpenAI for doing things like marketing content. Maybe if you had a short description of an article that you were using, or you wrote an article, you'd want to get short descriptions, maybe a tweet format, maybe some kind of a Facebook appropriate snippet. You could use OpenAI to generate all of those texts and the appropriate lengths and formats and so forth. Just a whole variety of uses. I think we're going to see more and more of it, and it's really easy to get it wired up. So I just wanted to show you how simple it is to pull an actual AI interaction into what ends up being a very simple workflow.
There's one more question related to automations.
Okay.
You mentioned scripted automations being on the roadmap. Which scripting knowledge will you need to be able to configure that?
It will use JavaScript format. So JavaScript's probably the most prevalent coding language in the world. And conveniently, it's what we are using in our front end. It will be JavaScript style syntax. It will be run in what's called a sandboxed environment, just to prevent people from doing nasty things with it. But you'll be able to make external REST API calls. You'll be able to interact with SmartSuite itself. You'll more than likely even be able to access certain metadata things. So doing things like adding a field. Those are all possible today through SmartSuite's API. And again, can be done even through Make. I was showing you these custom HTTP actions, or we have the make an authenticated call version of this, which is really just the same thing with a different wrapper to be able to do that today. Okay, open forum. I know we've gone over time, but I appreciate everyone staying with us. If you do have any additional questions, even if they're off topic, I'm happy to address them. Be available here for the next number of minutes and ask away.
There was one question that came in earlier. They said in Airtable, the results of find record come as HTML formatted list, and we run a script to isolate output values. How is it in SmartSuite?
Yeah, SmartSuite is not doing the same thing because we're not using it as an output. Let me switch back over. So let's add simple trigger and then a find records action. The difference is the find records action is actually being directly wired up with the update record. And basically, you can just tell it, here, I'm going to create a new one. And now, instead of the trigger, I want to hook it up to a find action. So I'm using the results of this find in this update. And that's the difference. Airtable does give you an option to basically take the results of that find and format it as HTML. We don't have that capability right at the moment. It's just wired up a little differently here. You're actually taking each one of these found records, and you're taking some action on that found record, as opposed to using that list, that in Airtable's case, that formatted HTML list, and trying to use it back here and updating the triggering record or whatever else. And now we are going to be enhancing this to be able to take that aggregation and do something back in the trigger. Right now, this update is specific to the found record, but you could subsequently have another update that would just update the trigger. So just a little bit of different methodology. Again, when we have the script action type, you'll be able to have complex logic that does things either at that found record level or using the aggregation of the find and making some update with the original trigger.
Another question that came in: once a SmartSuite automation is triggered, what events might cause it to fail? For example, say the user triggers an automation, then closes SmartSuite tab. Or perhaps a user triggers an automation for record 1 and then switches to record 2 and triggers the same automation. Are either of these problems?
Once the event's triggered, the event's fired and it's sent to the automation engine. So the follow-up user actions, unless they also trigger an automation, shouldn't have any bearing on the actual processing of that automation. So you don't have to worry about clicking a button and staying on the page until the automation fires. It will happen in the background and update the data for you. Okay. Any other questions, or we're a number of minutes over?
One last question.
Okay.
Someone said they'd love the ability to copy and paste and have SmartSuite add fields and make a good faith guess as to the field type, and that they've heard this is on the roadmap, and they were wondering if there was a timeline.
So copy and paste from Grid?
Yeah, copy and paste to Grid and have it be able to add new fields based on that paste. Yes.
Coming. You've probably already seen the paste to the existing fields, and that will prompt you and it'll add additional records. We're going to do the same thing with new fields. Basically, we're doing two things, and this has also been a frequent request. We're modifying the convert field function so that we'll allow you to change more fields to other field types. And ultimately, we want to make it pretty wide open, like Airtable is doing. You can change any field to any other type. We try to be thoughtful about preserving the data, which is why originally there were a number of restrictions. We're starting with text being able to be changed to a number of different field types. When we initially implement the create new fields, we're probably going to do that, have text field be able to be changed into a variety of field types and just create the new fields as text. And then you can decide what they actually are. Oh, this one's a values list, this one's a date, this one's a whatever. And the second step in that would be to try to be smarter about what field type we're actually creating. If you see a repeating pattern, oh, hey, this is probably a select list. Does it parse as it do all of the values and it parses a date? That's probably a date. So that'll probably be a staged process, but it's absolutely on the roadmap and it's coming soon, as in weeks. All right. Anything else pop up, Brian? Or otherwise, I want to thank everyone for taking the time to be with us today and hope that this was informative. Look forward to seeing you on upcoming webinars, and we'll keep drilling into the details. I love getting into the technical details of the automations. And as I mentioned, I'll be doing some additional videos and webinars on some of the more advanced features of Zapier and Make and API. And as they come, absolutely, with the webhook actions and triggers, and then scripting will be its own thing. I can't wait, but a little further down the line, but it's all coming. All right. Thanks again, everyone.